Thanks, Dan. As Dan mentioned, climate action is a young person's game, the title that I've given this talk. The argument is that young people, and I'm going to refer to me as a young person as well, so we have skin in the game, and therefore we will be the ones with enough motivation to make the necessary changes. So thanks, Dan, for organising this event. If you don't know me, I've been out of academia for a few years, and I haven't thought about giving conference talks since then, but I was delighted when Dan invited me. I was slightly hesitant because I wasn't sure if I had much to say, but I started thinking about the role that young people will play in this climate crisis, and it turned out I had a lot of opinions. So the second slide has unfortunately not rendered, but it was just an outline of what I'm going to talk about today, so I'll go through that. First off, I want to talk some doom and gloom, a la the Ipcc AR6 report. Then I'll mention a little bit about me, where I came from, and I'll do a piece on ZEN Energy. ZEN is the company I work for at the moment, and I want to talk about its background and my role in the company. And then I'll talk a bit more about what young people can do, which is where the title of this talk is coming from. And just a little piece on ZEN first. We are a growing business. We're always looking for smart and motivated people to join us. This talk is partially serving as a little bit of outreach for them. And if you're interested in learning more or in opportunities that we might have at the company, please reach out. So, Ipcc, this report came out, I think it was last month, and there were two points that I found particularly alarming. I'm hoping that the later speakers are also going to go into a bit more depth than I am here. So what I found alarming was that current CO2 levels are similar to those from the mid-Pliocene, 3 million years ago, and we estimate during those times that temperatures were 2.5 to 4 degrees higher than the baseline level from 1850 to 1900, and the sea level were 5 to 25 meters higher. This is in comparison to the Paris Agreement, where we're supposed to be limiting ourselves to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's quite a lot more scary. And the reason for this difference is because of some positive feedback mechanisms. And AR6 really hones in on some of the quantitative sides of these feedback mechanisms because we've collected more data nowadays. So the one is that there are many factors that go into the global surface temperature, and one of them is greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but there are many others, such as the ice sheets being white and reflecting a lot of the sun's energy away. So we've pushed the greenhouse gas levels up, but that hasn't reached the equilibrium yet. So that would cause some amount of warming, but now these secondary effects are causing warming, meaning that even if we reach net zero in 20 years, say, then the ice sheets will keep melting because we've pushed the temperature too high. They will keep reducing in size, and this will cause even further warming because of the reduced albedo of those regions. So this was pretty alarming to me. Now, a little bit about me. I've studied mathematics as an undergraduate and then as a master's student, as Dan mentioned, co-supervised by Dan. And after finishing my master's, I spent 12 months trying to decide on a mathematics PhD topic, but in the end I decided to try industry as a software engineer. I spent some time in software engineering analyst sort of roles before I finally landed at ZEN in 2020. Now, ZEN Energy, to understand the business, you need to know a little bit about Ross Garnaut. And Ross Garnaut is an economist who was commissioned to produce a climate change review for the Commonwealth Government of Australia in 2008 that examined the climate risks to Australia specifically. In 2011, he was commissioned to provide an update to that, and in it, he outlined some of the commercial opportunities. But still, dominant players in the market were resistant to any change. So in 2016, Ross joined with ZEN and was planning to act upon these commercial opportunities. So there is a difference between a theoretical profit margin and actually achieving profit. And yes, ZEN aims to make money in itself, but it's also our mission to demonstrate that a renewable strategy is commercially viable so that it's easier for us going into the future, but also for existing companies to transition with confidence and to break the way for new companies. Ross's 2019 book, Superpower, Australia's Low Carbon Opportunity, I think it was his 52nd book, so he's quite prolific, and you can go and read as many of them as you want. But this one in particular has gained a lot of interest, in Australia at least, and it details the opportunities that Australia has in a decarbonising world, explicitly because we have abundant renewable resources and huge land area to match it. He makes the case that we should be an innovator in the green revolution, in generation and storage technology, and we should build our experience and export this expertise. We should be developing energy-intensive industries like steel making, aluminium smelting, and emerging renewable hydrogen, because in a glut of renewable energy, Australian manufacturing will be very cheap and it will carry a highly valued net zero badge. In summary, we should become an economic superpower. Now, on my graphics slide, the second slide, I've got a diagram of the sun cable. And this is an example of other nations understanding our opportunity much better than we do. So Singapore is interested.
I'll just interrupt for a second. So if you haven't already figured this out, sorry for those who haven't been in an event before, I should have pointed this out earlier. You can click on these displays to get a full screen view. And he's now talking about the second set of slides, which is just to the right of the main one, with the sun cable at the top.
Yes, thank you, Dan. So Singapore is interested in a solar energy plant in the Northern Territory of Australia, and then joining that to Singapore by a nearly 4,000 kilometre long cable. They're interested in this because it is a relatively cheap form of green energy for a country without a significant land area. And for context, the 14 gigawatt solar farm is about 30 times the size of the current largest solar farm in Australia. And it's got a huge battery plant as well. And this is all planned by 2028. And it just makes you wonder what could happen if Australian governments built on these opportunities for the benefit of all Australians. And then I want to talk about the ambition of ZEN. So ZEN stands for Zero Emissions Now. And the core thesis has been that there is an opportunity for a new green entrant to beat the established players. These incumbents have been plagued by weak national climate policy, ideological politics, shareholders focused on short-term profits, and they've failed to agree on a strategy to tackle decarbonisation. It's too late now, and they are on a path to oblivion. For an example of this, see the recent AGL demerger, trying to rush something through at the last moment. So ZEN aims to capture market share by being on the right side of history where we already benefit from the cheapest form of energy, we might be held back and delayed by recalcitrant governments, but inevitably we will prevail. The strategy has been to utilise this cheapest form of power, solar energy, which, as of 2021, there are calculations that estimate a new solar farm is even cheaper than the ongoing cost of running a coal or a gas plant. So it is by far the cheapest form of power, the only challenge being its intermittency. So our innovation was to write the first long-term contracts with customers, backed by long-term agreements with solar generators. We've convinced the South Australian government that we were the best choice to realise their renewable future, and they've given us a 10-year supply contract. And we've used that and other contracts like this to bootstrap ourselves into this cycle that I've drawn. So with a long-term supply contract, we can go to a bank, and the bank will have confidence that we are able to make good on our loans. So that offers us cheaper credit. And with cheaper credit, we can go and procure cheaper green electricity, either by buying from existing solar generators or by going and developing our own, if it is cheaper to do so.
Could you say a bit more about what it means to sign a supply contract with ZEN? I mean, you presumably don't have $100 million power plants that you just summoned from nowhere. So you have, I mean, there are power generation assets that belong to ZEN, or this is like a kind of assuming you can use the market more efficiently than the current players to supply it at a reasonable cost or something like that?
Yeah, so we started out we signed long-term, what are called power purchase agreements. So you agree to purchase some amount of the power coming from a solar farm. And if you do that on a long-term scale, you can get it more cheaply because the solar farm is happy to have long-term certainty for their generation, and you are happy to have a slightly cheaper price than you might otherwise pay. And what we can do with this cheaper credit, now that we have access to it, is go and develop our own solar farms and our own batteries and our own pumped hydro storage assets. And that's what we're currently pursuing. And then, as I've drawn this as a cycle, we can use this cheap green electricity that we have access to be more competitive when bidding for supply contracts, and then taking those supply contracts and getting even cheaper credit because we have a more diverse portfolio as well as a credit history with the banks. So that has been the strategy. Now, what do I actually do at ZEN? Well, the core of my role that I'm in as a forecasting analyst is the load forecast. So this is trying to forecast half-hourly customer electricity demand 2 weeks ahead. And the reason it's 2 weeks ahead is because that's about the limit of a good weather forecast. So things that are going into these models are temperature, the average temperature over the past day, what day is it, what's the time, is it a school holiday, is it a public holiday? And the latest model architecture is gradient boosting trees, decision trees, which have been the most effective so far. So on my graphics slide, I've just put up on the left, the short-term load forecast performance in a period of February this year. And this is for an individual customer with the actual load in yellow, and in black is the forecast. So you can see that it's pretty good. It's not always this good. There are times when it's slightly off, and I hear about it from the traders. But on a whole, it's pretty good.
So this is your gradient boosted tree model?
That's correct.
Cool.
And as you can guess, well, with most of our customers, it's mostly temperature that drives it. These are customers that are in offices, hospitals, in prisons, in schools, and a lot of it is driven by air conditioning. So a 2-week forecast is pretty good for forecasting our earnings, estimating our earnings in the near future, but it's not terribly useful for hedging purposes, because hedging, almost all of hedging takes place 3 months in advance. So what we do to get a view of this, what we call medium term, about 6 months to a year in the future, is we do some Monte Carlo sampling, Monte Carlo simulation. So this is taking historical weather and sampling it millions of times to generate all of the weather scenarios we might expect in a given month. And on the right of that slide, where I've written medium-term forecast, each of these charts, each of the 12 charts is 1 month. So I take all of these millions of weather scenarios for a month and then feed that into the load forecast for a customer. And that will tell me millions of times what the expected load is in that given month. And from there, I produce a daily shape. And I actually produce a lot of daily shapes for each of the percentiles. So each of those lines in one of those charts is a percentile view of a day in this customer for a month. For example, the top one, I don't actually think there's a legend on there anymore. It's the 99th percentile. And then there's a 95th and a 90th percentile. That's the next line down. And what we can use this for is, if we want to, say, hedge to the 90th percentile, that means 1 in 10 years we will be off, but 9 in 10 years we should be hedged appropriately. I don't make those decisions, but this is the information I give to our trading team. So, because I'm talking to a mathematical audience, I have to talk about the most mathematical thing that I've done in my job, and that was battery optimization using linear programming. So we want to analyze the commercial viability of a battery, and the starting place is to figure out what is the maximum amount of money you could make from a battery operating in isolation. And in Australia, we have 5-minute electricity prices. It's slightly more complicated than that, but let's just stick with 5-minute electricity prices. So I take a 12-month period of 5-minute electricity prices, and then at each 5-minute period, do I want the battery to charge or discharge, and how much of each do I want it to do? And this can be formulated as a linear programming problem with a charge, discharge, and a storage level variable for each time step, and choose whatever optimizer can handle it the fastest. Now if you want the short answer, the answer is batteries are incredibly profitable. And we should have got one 2 years ago, if possible. Now the challenges after doing this optimal case are you don't always know what the future prices are. So you need to build models where you can make decisions without that perfect knowledge of the future. You also need to model the dispatch system, because every 5 minutes the price is set by an auction, and you are not guaranteed to get the price that you wanted. And add on to that, you need to factor in the rest of our portfolio in real time, which is why customer load forecasts are essential. You need to know if the customer is going to be using a lot of energy in the next 2 hours, or if you should save your charge for 4 hours' time when it might be more profitable to you. Similarly, on the generation side, we need to forecast whether there's going to be clouds blocking the solar farm. So there's a lot of things that go into the next steps after you've done the baseline case. Now to the final part of my talk. What can young people do? In my mind, the most important one is elections. People need to vote. We need to not just vote, but convince others to vote with us. And that means effectively engage with the people who don't currently believe in science. Cut through the culture war that is being used to distract us. It's irrelevant, but it's working. I think it's important to be angry and to show others why they should be angry too. Every week I am outraged by newly uncovered rorts, corruption, lies told to the public, and there's no accountability. The traditional media is not doing their part, they're not keeping up, and the voters are not engaged. Government rorts are getting to the scale where they're almost big data. You need to be skilled to uncover these things. You need to understand how to analyze large amounts of data, not by hand, to understand what's going on and the scale of it. I've done some small amount of volunteer work for an independent media organization using data and programming skills. I want to do more of this and I want to do it better, especially in the energy industry where there's a lot of politicization. The next thing I think we can do is vote with our money. Switch, this applies to mostly Australian audience. Switch your superannuation investments to sustainability. Superannuation is a sort of retirement fund in Australia. If your super fund doesn't have a sustainable option, leave them. There are many out there that do have a sustainable option. Super funds in Australia wield $3 trillion of capital, and they hold 40% of all Australian shares on the share market, and $120 billion flow in every year. This is an enormous pool of capital, and Australians actually have control over it. Companies are beholden to their shareholders, and super funds can have a large impact if they are instructed to by their owners. This will directly fund businesses of the future, and it will starve climate laggards of new capital. Shareholder action has actually been quite successful this year. In May, Chevron shareholders voted to reduce its Scope 3 emissions by selling less fossil fuels. Also in May, Exxon shareholders replaced two climate-focused board members. In August, an 18-year-old climate campaigner began a bid for election to the AGL board. And just yesterday, AGL shareholders voted for the company to outline a decarbonisation strategy and to link executive remuneration to the targets in that. And this was against the board's recommendation. You will also have noticed that corporate pledges for net zero have rapidly expanded in the last 12 months in Australia, which is well ahead of any government regulation. And that's all because they understand the huge economic risk they face if they don't act. They know there will be carbon border taxes, and they don't want their debt to become expensive. These all go to show that capital markets are beginning to take notice of climate risks, and this will have a real impact. They cannot make more coal with no money. And on a personal level, go for it.
I was going to say we have this solar crypto. Well, I was just reading recently that this, Bitcoin transactions were actually creating a lot of e-waste, and it's
Okay, let's have an argument about that, but let's let Heath finish his talk first. I'll argue the other side of that, maybe.
I would also argue that at this point in history, doing the right thing will probably make you more money. there is probably going to be outsized returns for sustainable investments in the future. But I've got to go back to the caveat at the top of the slide. This is all not financial advice. So, final slide is the vague and hopefully inspiring. Young people can innovate and imagine. Older generations might care about the future, but young people are actually going to have to live it. And we know that skin in the game is a powerful motivator. They haven't had to solve the climate problem, but we will. And that's question time. Oh, no, there's no question slide.
Thanks, Heath. That was really great. Yeah, questions? I guess I had a comment. So my current master's student, Liam, who I think is in the audience, also has an interest in data journalism. So I guess there's a lot of scope for letting people know about the way the current system works through good exposition and clever use of modern methods of communicating data-intensive information.
You said it much better than I could have, Dan.
And me. Yeah, I agree. There's so much data out there for these things, but there are not enough people looking at it and not enough people with the skills to understand it or present it in a way that can be understood by the important people who are making decisions, but also by the people who are voting.
What was the independent, I think you said a not-for-profit organisation that you were working for, Heath?
It's Michael West Media. I reached out to them because they were working on some of the government corruption, government rorts kind of big data things, but I thought I had some skills that they could use, and I want to do more of that. I haven't done as much of that as I wanted to.
Mm. Yeah, great to know. Thank you.
Heath, do you have, I assume you do, you have data for solar and specifically solar PV, but really any solar, and wind generation for the entire country, and region by region would be even better, but for the entire country on an hourly basis, is there a good historical database going back a ways at the hourly interval? And again, I know that. Sorry, go ahead.
For the Australian energy market, there is surprisingly great data going. I don't know quite how far back the really good data goes, but we have half-hourly data for all generators and all loads that go into the dispatch. So yes, we have solar for any individual solar plant that you want to look at, and you can aggregate them up, obviously, into their regions. And that's half-hourly, probably goes back, well, I don't know how far back the data goes back well, but certainly in the last 10 years, I'd say there'd be half-hourly data.
That's fantastic. That's great.
I don't know if you can quite get to it publicly. We get access to it as a retail company, and I'm sure there are ways to get at it without having that connection, but I don't exactly know how.
Okay, great. The modeling that my team does depends on having pretty high quality data at the hourly interval at least. Half hour would be interesting to see if we get any significant changes in what we see. I'm imagining it wouldn't be too significant, but we have a stock and flow, a Stella-based systems dynamics model approach, and having the solar and the wind data and the demand data for any given region or nation is how we determine the battery requirement for any hypothetical system. And it's a simplified approach, and we just solve for the battery requirement at any given hour. But the data around the world are surprisingly poor. Even in the United States, we were only able to use 2 years worth of data when comparing very different regions because it just wasn't available. But I had heard that Australia has particularly good data. And it would be interesting maybe to do a case study of Australia with that.
Yes, certainly. One thing I failed to mention was that I'm only talking about utility scale solar. There are some estimates of, I think pretty good estimates actually, of the rooftop solar as well in that mix, but I've never had a look at that. But if you are interested in the Australian market, it's called the NEM, N-E-M, for the National Energy Market. National Electricity Market. And there's a project called Open NEM that stores a lot of this data and makes it available publicly. I don't know how much is in there though.
Off you go. I guess feel free to ask more questions or discuss while we're running around collecting. Yeah, could you go into a bit more detail about how people actually, the model by which ZEN is, as a startup, aiming to compete with these massive energy corporations? This is quite ambitious, right? It's kind of predicated on their stupidity and looming collapse. Is that the reason this is even feasible for your investors, or what?
It's not so much. You can think of it as stupidity sometimes, but it is. It has moved very rapidly, and coal was really profitable up until about 3 years ago. So there were incentives to continue doing what they were doing, but it's moved very fast against them in just the last 12 months even. And there is now customers are starting to be willing to pay a premium for zero emissions, because it's not only good for brand, but it's also going to be the way of the future. But also, solar is simply the cheapest way to add new power now. It is cheaper, and anyone who says differently is wrong.
So I guess my impression is that this new generation of energy companies necessarily involves a higher level of, let's say, data analysis or similar skills just by the nature of the technology. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or is it sort of always? I can imagine there's plenty of people in Macquarie, trying to make money out of investing or making guesses about the current energy market, even if there was no renewable energy in it. But maybe to make the renewable system work, there's a higher level of this built in, or is that just a...
Absolutely. The system is currently, it's very much in flux, becoming much more flexible, because the market rules were all designed around some big centralized generators 20 years ago. But now we know that's not going to be the case going forward. So it's got to be designed cleverly, and also the players in the market have to be much more clever, make decisions on a real-time basis, whereas they used to be able to set and forget. One example of this is solar farms. They, up until this year, or late last year, they wouldn't change their output. They just would output as much as they could all the time. But now, because there are so many solar farms and wind generators and rooftop solar, all of that combines to make low demand and lots of generation in the middle of the day. And the price goes to negative $1,000 quite often in South Australia. And previously, up until last year, this happened occasionally, and all of the solar farms and wind farms just sucked it up and took it. But now they're all turning off. They're responding to these events.
Hi, Heath. Thanks for the talk. I have a question more on the sort of technical machine learning side.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about I guess you mentioned boosted trees. How the model selection process arrive at that particular solution, and because my impression is that trees aren't really great at time series kind of stuff, time series kind of things, because it is I think it is piecewise constant kind of prediction. Or maybe this is really just an interpolation based on temperature data or things like that. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, certainly. There's the choice of gradient boosted trees is so the challenge with forecasting energy demand, electricity demand, is that you have a very, very small number of examples of the extreme days. So the days where you've had a heat wave of 40 plus degrees for 3 days in a row, that might occur once every 4 years. So you don't have a lot of data to work with. And gradient boosted trees, they're geared towards being able to pick up those extreme cases and have a good portion of the model dedicated to those outliers, just by the nature of the model.
Right.
But that obviously comes with the limitation that, as you mentioned, it only interpolates. So if you haven't seen the most extreme example, then this won't forecast anything beyond that. So if you get something more extreme than you've ever trained it on, you will underperform. And what I would like to try at some point is neural networks. So I've heard reports that LSTM models work for electricity forecasting, but I haven't had the chance to try it as yet.
Right. Okay. I was wondering if more Bayesian method would, because I pick up on the talk that the error bars is particularly important for trading. So I thought a model where the errors are sort of built into it directly estimating the density instead of doing point estimate will be will be better. I have no idea how boosted trees estimate uncertainty, so that's part of my
that's actually an interesting point.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you guys. Hopefully we can continue that question later on, but we should get on to the next talk. So I'm going to end this coin run there. So let's see who won. I'll put the coins back at the end, but Kwang1094, well ahead. I saw Billy got onto those coins at the end there. Okay, so...
It drove the boat out. I should have done that first. I was trying to jump off the personal board, and of course the right approach was to drive the damn boat up the mountain and out into the air.
I just want to make the parkour. I believe you can make it without any help. Not even with support.
You don't even
it's possible. So.
Yeah, it's actually pretty straightforward. The trick is that at the end, one of the stones actually doesn't support your weight.
Yes.
You fall straight through it.
The left one is
you nailed me with that. You
left one is the coolest one. Like the first time I did it.
Oh yeah, I couldn't stop giggling when I made that. Okay, Adam, it's your you have the floor.